where we take a look at music, movies, books, and other media that's either out of print, out of reach, or has never been released. I'm Lana, and today we're revisiting the Mueller Report. Remember the movie Beetlejuice? Yeah, I know. It's a weird question to open with when you're talking about a document that examines Russian interference in a U.S. election. But humor me for a moment. In Beetlejuice, the Maitlands, played by Alec Baldwin and Geena Davis, inexplicably arrive home after driving off the road, with no real recollection of the time that passed between those two events. Stranger still, they find that they're unable to leave their house. At least, they're not able to leave and venture out into the world that was once outside of their door. And all of the new bizarre occurrences in their world seem to coincide with the unexplainable appearance of a book. The Handbook for the Recently Deceased. The premise is understandable enough. When you're dead, this book outlines everything you need to know about your new life, or afterlife more appropriately. But as Alec Baldwin's character immediately notices, it reads like stereo instructions. The big ideas are lost in an overly complicated sea of carefully placed details. It's a document made to fulfill a bureaucratic requirement, rather than to be of any legitimate help to someone who unwittingly stumbles upon it. And that's true of most any legal document, really. The devil is most definitely in the details. The more you try to make sense of it, the more it can all become disorienting. Such is the Mueller Report. We know the big ideas. Russia interfered with the 2016 presidential election. And even though members of the Trump campaign appeared to have been complicit, the FBI could not conclusively say that the president himself colluded with Russia. And just to make sure there's complete transparency on the issue, the Mueller Report was released to the public in 2019. So end of story, right? Well, not entirely. What the public received was a document with more holes in it than a slice of Swiss cheese. Many parts of it were heavily redacted, probably due to concerns of privacy, national security, liability, or just a matter of policy. But because so much of the Mueller Report remains incomplete, it more than qualifies as missing media. So what details are missing? And how important are they to understanding all of the evidence that's compiled into this massive 448-page document that was made available to us? And just to be clear, it's not as though there's just a little black box here and there to protect someone's identity. There are entire pages that are almost entirely covered in blacked out text. Now, to be fair, that's not entirely out of the ordinary for a released government document. Even the declassified JFK assassination files still had some redacted details, despite there being information as intimate as Social Security numbers having been released to the public. And while anyone who spent any amount of time doom-scrolling through news sites knows the basic premise of the Mueller Report, putting all the details together in a coherent, easy-to-understand narrative is nothing short of a very tall order. As you've probably guessed, I have my own speculations on what's been left out, and I'll do my best to fill in the gaps as we go along. But telling this story isn't easy. It's a hard look back in the rearview mirror, and we've come so far that some of the most important landmarks are beginning to become too distant to make out as clearly as we'd like. If you approach the story chronologically, events that seem relevant to each other sometimes become isolated from one another. So, which event should we even begin with? Well, I think it's best to start with what might have been the catalyst for all of this, the 2012 Russian presidential election. Vladimir Putin is notoriously resourceful when it comes to staying in power. In addition to his current stint in the presidential office, he also served as president from 2000 to 2008. And even though he couldn't legally serve a third term afterward, he found a way around that little problem. He sidestepped to the role of prime minister under the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev. Putin ran for president again in 2012 and won. And who would become his prime minister? None other than Dmitry Medvedev. Understandably, there was a lot of concern in Russia that Vladimir Putin had rigged the 2012 presidential election. Protesters took to the street, dissent was beginning to split the Kremlin, and there were rumors of a revolution coming. And if that weren't enough bad news for Vladimir Putin, Hillary Clinton was the straw that broke the camel's back. She criticized the Russian election results as being dishonest and unfair.
We have serious concerns about the conduct of those elections. Independent political parties such as Parnas were denied the right to register. And the preliminary report by the OSCE cites election day attempts to stuff ballot boxes, manipulate voter lists, and other troubling practices. We're also concerned by reports that independent Russian election observers, including the nationwide Golos network, were harassed and had cyber attacks on their websites, which is completely contrary to what should be the protected rights of people to observe elections, participate in them, and disseminate information. We commend those Russian citizens who participated constructively in the electoral process. And Russian voters deserve a full investigation of electoral fraud and manipulation.
To Putin, this condemnation amounted to election interference, and apparently that meant that the game was on. It seems as though Putin's regime was out for a little revenge, or maybe a lot. Statecraft seems to be what Putin does best, and just as he put a pawn into the Russian presidential office with Dmitry Medvedev, he would find a useful pawn in America as well, with a member of the 2016 Trump campaign named George Papadopoulos. George Papadopoulos is an American oil and energy tycoon who seems to have unwittingly entered this story sometime around March 14th of 2016. He was traveling in Italy when he met a Maltese international relations professor named Joseph Mifsud. In addition to being a university lecturer, Mifsud had ties to the Kremlin, and it was his ties to the Russian government that Papadopoulos found so intriguing. The oil consultant had been working for the Donald Trump presidential campaign, and a new connection to a global superpower like Russia seemed like a great way to show his value to Donald Trump. Now, Mifsud wasn't initially all that interested in talking with Papadopoulos. That is, until Papadopoulos mentioned that he was working for the Donald Trump campaign. Mifsud was, of course, interested in U.S. politics, and very interested in Donald Trump. I mean, the guy is a political science lecturer, so nothing seemed at all out of the ordinary. Not yet, anyway. Just a few days later, on March 19th, the chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, John Podesta, received an email stating that he needed to change his Google password. Like most wealthy and powerful people, Podesta didn't handle his own email account. He had an assistant to do that for him. Well, one of the staff members in the IT department identified the email as a phishing scam. But when the IT representative was composing a message to the assistant overseeing the account, the IT representative mistakenly used the word legitimate instead of illegitimate. So, naturally, the assistant clicked on the big blue button that said Change Password, and Russian hackers gained entry into the Democratic National Committee, an event that would be discovered by the cybersecurity firm Dell Security Works. Now, if you find the story of this email debacle hard to believe, you're not alone. It sounds like a great way to cover up a terrible oversight. But whether the explanation is real or just a cover-up, this serious lapse in judgment opened a door for Russian hackers to data mine the Clinton campaign and gain access to government servers and personal records that could unleash unimaginable damage. It's cybersecurity nightmare fuel, but hardly the last bit of nightmare fuel that we'll see on our way through this very messed up story. Now, Barack Obama was still president at this point, and when news of a Russian cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee reached him, he responded by ejecting 35 Russian intelligence operatives from the United States and placing sanctions on the Russian Intelligence Directorate and the Russian Federal Service, which is considered to be the modern-day equivalent to the KGB. And if you think Putin was mad before, by this point, he was probably livid. A few days later, Papadopoulos was named foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, before traveling to London for another meeting with Joseph Mifsud, and a young lady who's said to have been Vladimir Putin's niece. They wanted to make sure that they could set up a meeting with Trump soon and forge a positive relationship between Russia and the Trump campaign. The following month, the Maltese professor told Papadopoulos that he had some dirt on Hillary Clinton that might be of some use to the Trump campaign. So what kind of Russian super spy produced this top secret dirt on Hillary Clinton? Well, that would be none other than Cozy Bear. remember the Russian Federal Service, the modern-day KGB? Well, they did a tremendous amount of damage to the 2016 U.S. presidential election under the horrifying codename of Cozy Bear. They were hacking into the U.S. State Department, and thanks to the phishing email that they, or one of the organizations they were working with, sent to the Democratic National Committee, they had access to the White House and maybe even some of Barack Obama's confidential emails. And Cozy Bear wasn't alone. They worked with another group of Russian hackers with an even more formidable name, Fancy Bear. Yes, the most dangerous elements in our story are by far Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. Fancy Bear was a wing of Russia's Foreign Military Intelligence Agency, and as cuddly as it may sound, it was anything but. It's worth mentioning that some sources say that it was Fancy Bear and not Cozy Bear that hacked into the DNC. Whether one or both of them is responsible, our two creepypasta bears hung onto their stolen data for months before they made their move. They sat on it until they could weaponize it at just the right moment, and that was in October of 2016, a month before the US presidential election. So, what did they do with all this data? Well, they gave it to Julian Assange, the Australian publisher of WikiLeaks, who became the mouthpiece of our two creepypasta bears. And the sensitive State Department data that they had pilfered was now public domain. Now, obviously, the State Department considers this information to be stolen. And even though Assange denies having received the documents from Russian intelligence, the Mueller Report has shown us that there are so many people involved in this story that I don't know how anyone could be 100% sure of the origin of any piece of intel from Russia. And that's exactly how sophisticated Russia is at covering its tracks. Assange said he got his information from a lone hacker calling themselves Guccifer 2.0, and they boasted that they were the ones who had hacked into the Democratic National Committee. So, did Guccifer 2.0 work with the creepypasta bears? I don't know. But for the sake of simplicity, just remember that anyone in this story with a name that sounds like a Reddit user ID probably hacked into the DNC. Anyway, once WikiLeaks published the information and the media began to circulate the stories, things got understandably bad for Clinton's campaign, and good for Trump's. What wasn't so good for Trump was that his numerous, and I do mean numerous, allegations of sexual misconduct were beginning to become of interest to the media. So how did all of this come to light? Well, Trump was having a dispute with a former Miss Universe pageant winner named Alicia Machado, which really heated up after he publicly criticized her weight. Now, this story does not appear in the Mueller Report, though it may have been redacted. Trump made some very disparaging remarks about Machado, as he often does about everyone he dislikes, and when allegations of misogyny started to crop up online, that prompted NBC News to publish the famous soundbite of what's so often been dismissed as locker room talk.
And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
Now, this was around 10 years old at the time, but it's still very telling of Trump's character. Now look, I'm not saying that people don't learn from their past mistakes and grow as human beings, but bear in mind that at least 29 females have accused Trump of sexual misconduct. 29! And notice that I said females and not women, because at least one accusation came from a USA pageant contestant who was only 13 years old at the time. And if the number of these cases alone doesn't put things into perspective, let's run down the list of accusers. Jill Harth, Katie Johnson, E. Jean Carroll, Summer Zervos, Alva Johnson, Jessica Leeds, Kristen Anderson, Stacey Williamson, Beatrice Kuhl, Lisa Boyne, Kathy Heller, Temple Taggart, Amy Doris, Karina Virginia, Karen Johnson, Mindy McGillivray, Rachel Crooks, Natasha Stoynoff, Juliette Huddy, Jessica Drake, Nini Loxonen, Cassandra Cierlis, Mariah Beato, Victoria Hughes, Bridget Sullivan, Tasha Dixon, Samantha Holvey, and this list also includes Trump's ex-wife Ivana and an unnamed Miss USA contestant. Now look, I know that it's tedious to listen to someone read names off of a list, but I wanted to make a point. Now you're probably thinking all of this is beyond terrible, but what does it have to do with accusations of collusion with Russia? Well, if you think back to the 90s, the Bill Clinton sex scandal was really damaging to the then president's reputation. So why haven't any of the sexual misconduct allegations against Donald Trump been complete kryptonite for his presidential campaign? Especially with the religious right, who seem to adore him by and large. There's probably not one simple answer, but a big part of it comes from Pizzagate. Pizzagate is a bizarre story that popped up on 4chan in 2016 and spread across the internet like wildfire. Basically, it said that the Clintons were running a child sex ring out of a number of locations, the most notable of which is a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. called the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria. And in the case of the pizzeria, all of this was said to be happening in the basement. Now, I've never known of any pizza parlor to have had a basement, but this is the story. Now, if all of this sounds insane, that's because it is. But for some reason, the internet loves weird, shocking stories. Every other video thumbnail on YouTube has someone with their mouth agape, feigning shock and awe. And even though we know absolutely nothing shocking has happened, people love to click on this stuff for some reason. So the made-up insanity of Pizzagate rose to the top. And as a result, social media sites seemed to lose interest in Trump's rather rapey reputation as the Pizzagate insanity got more and more out of hand.
According to police, Welch said that he had read online that the Comet Ping Pong restaurant was harboring child sex slaves, and that he wanted to see for himself if they were there. The suspect said he was armed to help rescue them.
And this is far from the only weird smear story against Democrats that cropped up around this time. Remember the creepypasta bears? I know, how could you forget? Well, they were hard at work. And they weren't the only Russian hackers who were hard at work either. Russia had a number of hacker organizations that are collectively known to the media as the troll factories. Like the creepypasta bears, they're typically run round the clock by hackers paid to further Russian interests abroad. The most widely known of them is the IRA, or the Internet Research Agency, which is sometimes called Glavset. They set up fake accounts on major social networking sites like Twitter and Facebook for the sake of promoting the Trump campaign and MAGA ideals to US voters. Now, this may sound like the work of a few bots, but the Kremlin doesn't kid around. The troll factories employed hundreds of people who made it their sole mission to promote pro-Kremlin ideology across the world, and that included promoting Donald Trump. Now, you're probably thinking that they made a few targeted ads and that was the end of it. But professional trolls were able to monitor people's accounts, find out what account holders really cared about, and then they used that information to craft their content creation. Pretty much just like every other business on the internet does. And while that may not sound all that nefarious, they created fake news outlets, user groups, and even organized in-person rallies, dozens of which are said to have been identified by the Mueller investigation. In 2018, the IRA was indicted on charges of violating criminal laws with the intent to interfere with U.S. elections and political processes, which is exactly what was meant to happen. The troll factories were private enterprises for a reason. That gave the Kremlin plausible deniability. And if there are two words that sum up the Mueller experience, as I'm going to call it, it's definitely plausible deniability. But unlike so many who had plausible deniability in this story, our friend George Papadopoulos unfortunately had none. The FBI found out about his meetings with the Maltese professor, and when they confronted him about it, he lied. The problem is, of course, that international travel is a really hard thing to keep secret from the FBI. In 2017, Papadopoulos pled guilty to a felony charge of making false statements. But it's good to have friends in high places, apparently, because Donald Trump granted him a full pardon in 2020. That's one pawn removed from the chessboard, but plenty of other pawns were still on the move. One such pawn was Carter Page, a petroleum industry consultant who, unsurprisingly, wasn't too happy about U.S. sanctions on Russian oil. Since 2013, he had been in contact with Russian intelligence agents who were posing as businessmen, and unbeknownst to Carter Page, he was also under surveillance by the FBI. The FBI had become concerned that Carter Page was being targeted as an asset, since intercepted Russian intelligence had described him as somewhat of a useful idiot. Unfortunately for Page, it seems as though he was only really useful to the Russians because he was off the Trump campaign before Trump was even elected. Purportedly, Page offered sensitive details on U.S. sanctions against Russia in exchange for contact with Russian trade representatives, probably of the oil tycoon variety. After meeting with Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Arkady Dvorkovich in 2016, Page gave a speech in Russia that basically criticized the use of sanctions as being too harsh. He made contact with a number of Russian government officials there, including Putin's Deputy Chief for Internal Policy, who offered Page documents that would be detrimental to Hillary Clinton's reputation and credibility. But Page wasn't at all good at keeping things on the down low. He mentioned this conversation to an Australian diplomat who unsurprisingly notified the U.S. government that Russia was digging up dirt. And the Russians weren't the only ones digging up dirt in this story either. One of the documents to make headlines in this story is the Steele dossier. And as a little bit of conjecture on my part, I think it may be possible that some of the redacted content from the Mueller Report may be from this document. Why? Because it's a privately contracted intelligence document that was generated outside the sphere of U.S. intelligence agencies, which understandably means that it's to be examined with a cautious eye. Now, make no mistake, the author of the Steele dossier, Christopher Steele, is very much a part of the Mueller Report, but some of the sources for his own investigation into all of this remain unidentified, and his ties to the Clinton campaign don't exactly qualify him as impartial. So who is Christopher Steele, and what does he have to do with any of this anyway? Well, in 2016, the Hillary Clinton campaign wanted to do a little of its own dirt digging on Trump's ties to Russia, and to do that, they hired a private research firm in Washington called Fusion GPS, who subcontracted the job to a British spy named Christopher Steele. Steele had made a name for himself in 2006 with an investigation into the assassination of a Russian whistleblower named Alexander Litvinenko, who exposed the operations of Putin's regime, which had been up to the usual spy movie shenanigans, namely ties to the Russian mob, murders, and kidnappings. Russian agents poisoned Litvinenko with a tiny dose of a radioactive isotope called polonium-210. The assassins themselves, despite exposure, lived to tell the tale, but Litvinenko unfortunately died in the hospital. Christopher Steele had been part of the investigation that tied Litvinenko's death to Russia. So hey, if you need information on covert Russian activities, you could definitely do worse than hiring Christopher Steele. Now, when information on the Steele dossier started to become public, the internet, of course, latched onto the weirdest story it could possibly find from the document. The infamous pee-pee tape. Yeah, it's just as weird and stupid as it sounds. Supposedly, when Trump was in Moscow for the 2013 Miss Universe pageant, he booked the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where he paid sex workers to put on a show for him that involved peeing on hotel beds that the Obama family had previously slept in. This is said to have been captured on tape by the Russian Federal Security Service and supposedly retained for the purpose of future blackmail, if needed. This story's weird. Really weird. It's so juvenile and laughable that it's hard to even take seriously. While it's definitely not as outlandish as Pizzagate, it's so weird and out there that it's usually dismissed as a bogus story. And that's cast a very uncomfortable shadow on the Steele dossier, which is filled with allegations of collusion and elections interference. But, as I mentioned before, many of Steele's sources are unidentified, meaning his credibility is questionable. But if someone gathering information on a Russian crime boss asked you to lend your name to a document with incriminating evidence in it, would you do it? I mean, that didn't work out so well for Alexander Litvinenko. And rest assured, radiation poisoning is an absolutely horrific way to die. So one has to wonder if the creation of the Steele dossier was all for nothing. And to make matters worse, Hillary Clinton used campaign funds for this work-for-hire investigative report, which means that she should have disclosed that expense to the Federal Elections Commission, which she didn't do. So the Democratic National Committee was fined $105,000, and the Clinton campaign was fined $8,000. Now, to them, it probably seemed like a necessary expense when you consider all the lengths that the Kremlin will supposedly go to just to win. And to make matters worse, it was looking as though the Kremlin had not only poised the Republicans to win, but seemingly recruited some of their faithfuls as Russian assets. One such Republican faithful was Michael Flynn, one of Trump's national security advisors. Remember those Russians that Obama kicked out of the United States after the DNC hack? Well, Flynn told Russian diplomat Sergei Kislyak to make sure that Russia didn't do anything retaliatory, because Trump would reverse the charges against Russia and make everything right. So how could Flynn possibly offer those kind of assurances on Trump's behalf? And how exactly did he think Russia would retaliate anyway? We may never know, but Flynn's conversations were picked up by U.S. intelligence as part of their routine surveillance on Russian agents. Flynn lied to U.S. intelligence about asking the Russian ambassador to secure a vote from Russia on a UN resolution regarding Israeli settlements. Flynn wanted to make sure that Russia would back Israeli interests, but when asked about it, he lied. And that's not the only strike against his character. Flynn was also involved in a sinister plot to kidnap Fethullah Gulen, a high-profile Turkish cleric who had claimed asylum in the United States. But since we have so many forks in the road already, let's leave that story for another time. In April of 2017, during the 10th anniversary celebration of Russian TV network RT, Flynn was paid $45,000 to deliver a speech at the Moscow celebration of the event, and he was seated right next to Vladimir Putin. Michael Flynn may have been a Russian operative, but he most certainly was not a covert one. Long story short, Trump fired the man, unsurprisingly, and Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russia. Strangely, Trump also asked the director of the FBI, James Comey, to call off the FBI's investigation on Michael Flynn. Now, since Trump had already decided that Flynn was unfit for service, what interest would Trump possibly have in calling off the FBI's investigation? To be clear, Trump never used the words "drop the investigation." Purportedly, he said, "I hope you can let this go." But regardless, he wanted the investigation dropped. Understandably, Comey understood this to be a direct order, but it wasn't one that he was in a position to follow, because the investigation of Michael Flynn was part of a much bigger investigation. On March 20th of 2017, James Comey, the director of the FBI, told Congress that the FBI was investigating Russian interference into the U.S. presidential election, and they were looking for any connections to the Trump campaign. The information was now becoming public. Donald Trump seems to have panicked at this point. He immediately started contacting intelligence officials, the Attorney General, and Comey himself, asking for public statements that he was not under investigation. An exasperated Trump then told Attorney General Jeff Sessions that his presidency was over. He said that he was fucked. And there's a good deal of evidence that suggests he probably should have been at this point. Needless to say, Trump was not happy with James Comey. Trump had asked for loyalty. He had asked for reassurances that he wasn't under investigation. He had asked for the Michael Flynn investigation to be called off. And he hadn't gotten what he wanted. So Trump did what he loves to do so much. And on May 9th of 2017, Trump fired James Comey. Aside from not calling off the Michael Flynn investigation, Trump had two reasons for firing James Comey. One, James Comey's handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email scandal. If you happen to remember this from the news at the time, Hillary Clinton was facing a lot of heat for having used a private email server for official public communications, rather than having used official State Department email accounts. Now, Donald Trump had a vested interest in investigating his opponent, and he didn't think that the FBI had been aggressive enough in its investigation. Winning the presidential race wasn't enough for him. He was out for a conviction, and he wasn't happy about not getting the results he wanted. The FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's scandal had concluded that Clinton had been extremely careless, but that she didn't act with criminal intent, which wasn't at all what Trump wanted to hear. So no prosecution was ever pursued. Some say that Trump found that explanation unacceptable and fired Comey over it. But not everyone agrees. Which brings us to our second reason he had for firing Comey: obstruction of justice. Not James Comey's obstruction of justice, but Donald Trump's. Trump repeatedly asked for assurance that Comey would be loyal to him, and Trump didn't exactly get that. He even went so far as to directly ask for it while the two men were having a private dinner. Comey responded by promising to be honest with the president, but that's about as far as his reassurances went. It looks as though Trump wanted to impede the FBI's investigation into his campaign, so he fired their director. On May 17th of 2017, Robert Mueller, a former director of the FBI, was assigned as a special counsel to the Trump-Russia investigation, and the FBI's findings had been compiled into a document that we now know as the Mueller Report. This is where the plot begins to thicken. Donald Trump seemed very worried, and Trump even warned Mueller very publicly on July the 19th of 2017 not to investigate his finances. Trump tried to oust Mueller 4 times, but rather than do it himself, he wanted special counsel Don McGahn to pressure Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein to do it. But McGahn and Rosenstein both refused to cook up a story and fire someone on Trump's behalf, and McGahn advised the president that impeding the FBI's investigation could be construed as obstruction of justice. On July 26th of 2017, the FBI raided the home of Paul Manafort, the head of the Trump campaign. Manafort had been working with, or maybe for, Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch worth over $5 billion. Manafort had also previously worked for Ukraine's former pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, whose administration was famous for the mass killing of almost 100 protesters. Manafort had laundered tens of millions of dollars in payments from Yanukovych's pro-Russian party in Ukraine in order to hide it from the IRS. Emails intercepted by the FBI showed that Manafort had offered to debrief Russian oligarch Deripaska on the 2016 presidential race, and the email exchanges made references to our friend V, a name that's been attributed to Viktor A. Boyarkin, a suspected Russian intelligence officer. Mueller's first indictment resulted in 12 counts against Manafort, including conspiracy against the United States, tax fraud, and money laundering. Manafort was found guilty on counts of filing false tax returns, bank fraud, and failing to disclose foreign bank accounts. Now, if you were wondering how Manafort laundered all of this money, the short answer is real estate. And if you want to learn a little something about real estate, look no further than Manafort's boss. Donald Trump is famous for his real estate debacles. He's been bankrupt 4 times, and 6 of his hotel casinos have closed down. He's long been in the business of losing money, and though you can't conclusively say with the evidence we have that he's been laundering money, members of his campaign most definitely have, and losing money is part of the laundering process. If you got some dirty money, all you need to do is buy some property, flip it at a loss, and the money that you come away with is now clean. If you're looking to launder a lot of money, what better way than to put a casino in your hotel, where people are constantly losing money every day without fail? In fact, a 1998 IRS settlement showed that Trump Taj Mahal failed to correctly report gamblers who cashed out $10,000 or more in a single day. So, when you consider the demise of Trump Plaza Hotel in Atlantic City, or Trump Marina Hotel Casino, Trump's World Fair Atlanta, Trump Casino and Hotel Indiana, Trump 29 in California, and Trump Taj Mahal, these are probably all coincidences, right? I don't know. But if you want a real estate project to fail, look no further than Trump's business partner, Felix Sater. He's a Russian American with connections to the Russian mafia, and he has an assault conviction for stabbing someone in the face with a broken margarita glass. In 1998, he was found guilty of fraud in connection to a $40 million stock scam run by the Russian mob. Basically, pump and dump stock schemes, like money laundering, are a way for criminals to amass clean money fast, but without the financial loss involved. You buy a stock, inflate its value by spreading rumors and giving people false information, and then you sell it for a profit. Now, you or I would probably have done some serious jail time for a crime like that. But one of the bizarre things about America is that you can become so devious as to be valuable to the authorities. So, instead of jail time, Felix Sater was offered a deal to be an informant for the FBI. To make a weird story even weirder, Felix was also approached by the CIA to be an informant on the Russian mafia. He claimed to have prevented assassination attempts on George W. Bush and Colin Powell. So he's one of the good guys, right? Well, probably not if you ask people from Kazakhstan, the former Soviet republic. An oligarch from Kazakhstan named Ilyas Krapanov had a real estate company called Bayrock Group that Felix Sater joined in the early 2000s. Krapanov was part of an embezzlement scheme that had caused $300 million in damages to the city of Almaty in Kazakhstan. And Krapanov was looking for a way to launder the money he'd stolen from them. So what better way to do that than find a real estate mogul looking to move some properties? Now, how privy Felix Sater was to all this remains unclear, but he introduced himself to Donald Trump on Bayrock's behalf, and the rest is history. Interestingly enough, when Sater met Trump, Trump was purportedly over $1 billion in debt after the failure of his Atlantic City building, and the cash cow that was Bayrock Group seemed to come around at just the right time to help Trump with his new projects. Sater and Trump worked together on the completion of the Trump International Hotel in Soho, which unsurprisingly was an astounding commercial failure, as it may well have been designed to be. Condos there were purchased by prominent figures from Kazakhstani business and politics, and an ongoing lawsuit in Kazakhstan said that the funds used to purchase these condos was stolen. But not all of the stolen money went into Trump Soho. Some of it was invested into a new Trump Tower project in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. The Trump Tower there was never built, but Trump collected $1 million in licensing rights. Another successful failure, it would seem. And speaking of Trump Towers that were never built, one of Trump's long-standing plans was the completion of a Trump Tower in Moscow. And it just so happens that Felix Sater was so well connected in Russia that he was able to give Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka a tour of the Kremlin. In fact, Felix Sater was so confident in the Trump Tower Moscow project that he sent an email about it to his old friend Michael Cohen, who just by sheer coincidence was also Trump's lawyer. The email said, "I will get Putin on the program and we will get Donald elected." Unsurprisingly, this communique was intercepted by the FBI, and it raises some very big questions. How could Felix Sater make those kind of guarantees? And what does Trump's lawyer have to do with all of this anyway? Michael Cohen was a personal injury lawyer in the 1990s who was very business savvy with his investments. He met Donald Trump at a fundraiser and started doing legal work for him from there. And he even bought an apartment in Trump Tower, where he became exceedingly good at making Trump's problems disappear. When news of Trump's extramarital affairs began to surface, Michael Cohen made sure that the story stayed as quiet as possible. One such story involves Karen McDougal, who was a Playboy playmate who was offered a writing job to create content for OK Magazine, Star, and Radar Online, all of which are owned by Donald Trump's friend David Pecker. And the rights to her story about her affair with Trump were purchased by the National Enquirer, which is also incidentally owned by David Pecker. The Enquirer, however, never did anything with the story. They effectively killed it. In short, they bought it to ensure that it would stay buried. McDougal's lawyer had been in contact with Cohen, though it wasn't clear at the time what hand he had in the deal. Ultimately, as you've probably guessed, Donald Trump had been the source of the money used to buy off her story. In 2011, adult film star Stormy Daniels was offered $15,000 to talk to In Touch magazine about the affair she had with Donald Trump. But she never did because Michael Cohen threatened to sue the magazine. She did, however, receive an offer on the rights to her story at no less than $130,000 from a company called Essential Consultants LLC in Delaware, a bogus company that had been set up by Michael Cohen to cover Trump's tracks. One of the remaining questions about the source of this hush money is whether or not it was taken from campaign funds. Cohen's office and Trump Tower apartment were raided by the FBI in 2018. When Cohen appeared before Congress, he told them that he himself had paid the hush money. David Pecker, strangely, was granted immunity from prosecution, and he says that he has further documentation proving that Trump bought off other women to keep them quiet. Michael Cohen pled guilty to 8 felony charges, 2 of which were campaign finance violations, and he said that he did so at Trump's instruction. But as president, Donald Trump is immune to prosecution. Now, just for those of you who are keeping count, neither Karen McDougal nor Stormy Daniels were in the list I read off earlier of Trump's accusations of sexual misconduct. This probably all sounds like the beginnings of a very, very dark conspiracy, but rest assured, this is far from the beginning. Trump's connections to Russian crime go pretty far back, and they're a glaring omission from the Mueller Report. In 1984, a Russian mobster named David Bogatin bought 5 condos from Donald Trump. The government seized those condos, of course, because they were used to launder money for the Russian mob. Now, if you're wondering if all of this is just a giant coincidence, let's fast forward to 1987. In 87, Yuri Dubinin, who was a former Soviet ambassador to the UN, invited Trump to Moscow to discuss business projects. A few weeks later, Trump paid $95,000 to run a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, calling for U.S. politicians to drop excessive defense spending in the Middle East and Japan, and essentially minimizing post-war alliances. Now, that may just sound like a matter of fiscal policy, but consider that these alliances are what have helped stave off the spread of Soviet influence. And suspiciously, the end of these alliances would have been very beneficial to Russia, and the number of Trump's Russian friends seemed to be growing. Back in 2008, when a global recession shook the world, the U.S. housing market was dreary, to say the least. Donald Trump, however, was able to sell a home in Palm Beach for close to $100 million to a Russian oligarch named Dmitry Rybolovlev. 4 years earlier, Trump had purchased it for $41 million, but Rybolovlev bought it for somewhere around $54 million more than Donald Trump had paid for it. To anyone else trying to sell a home after the housing crash, this would have been nothing short of a miracle. And Rybolovlev wasn't the only Russian to take an interest in Trump's properties in Florida. So many Russians bought properties there that the Trump Sunny Isles apartments were beginning to become known as Little Moscow by as early as the 1990s. And Trump looks after his property's residents. Russian crime boss Semyon Mogilevich is said to have had several operatives residing in Trump properties, including David Bogatin. Remember him, the mobster who bought 5 units in Trump Tower? Well, Semyon Mogilevich has since unsurprisingly been investigated by the FBI, and those on the investigation have seen no shortage of trouble from Donald Trump. Bruce Orr, a Justice Department lawyer during that investigation, received frequent threats from Donald Trump to have his security clearance removed. And Lisa Page, an FBI lawyer working on the investigation, was fired for sending text messages that were critical of Donald Trump. And Semyon Mogilevich isn't the only Russian crime boss with ties to Donald Trump either. Semyon Mogilevich is said to have had several operatives residing in Trump properties. Vyacheslav Kirillovich Ivankov was another Russian mobster residing in Trump Tower in the 1990s, who used fraudulent documents to search the homes of wealthy people and steal money and valuables. In Alan Bloch's book, All is Clouded by Desire, Semyon Mogilevich is said to have arranged for Ivankov's release from a Siberian prison in 1991, where he had been held for robbery and torture before fleeing to the United States. Apparently, Trump's property seemed like a good option for someone in his position, just as it had been for others. According to a 2017 Bloomberg investigation into Trump World Tower, A third of the units sold on floors 76 through 83 involved people or limited liability companies connected to Russia and neighboring states by the year 2004. Vadim Trencher, a professional poker player, had bought a unit on the 63rd floor of Trump Tower during the early 2000s, and he ran an illegal gambling ring with Anatoly Golubchik, whose client base was made up of primarily Russian oligarchs. Trump literally had a full house when it came to Russian mobsters. Pun intended. And if there's anything that mobsters like more than organized crime and money laundering, it's guns. Now, those of you who are familiar with this story know that I'm about to pivot to the NRA, a very glaring omission from the Mueller Report. But before we dive in, I want to be very clear that I'm not disparaging Second Amendment rights, and I in no way mean to discredit any of the positive things that the NRA has done for gun safety education. But make no mistake, the NRA is said to have spent $30 million on the 2016 Trump campaign, which is a much larger amount of money than they spent on previous candidates. And as of 2018, they will no longer have to disclose their donors. Now, in America, we typically conflate gun rights with the political far right. But in an autocratic regime like Russia, the government usually doesn't want there to be an armed public that could potentially revolt. This is where we get to the story of Maria Butina, a Russian gun enthusiast who wanted to retain as many gun rights as she could for Russian citizens. In her early 20s, she joined Putin's United Russia Party and became an assistant to Russian Senator Alexander Torshin. She even started a lobbyist group called Right to Bear Arms in order to promote firearms rights in Russia. She made a lot of powerful connections as a lobbyist, including John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor. She also made connections with the upper echelons of the NRA. As strange as it sounds, the head of the NRA and his compatriots actually flew to Russia to visit one of Butina's conferences. Now, when you consider that the Kremlin is not at all interested in gun rights for the public, this show of support is kind of unusual. What did the NRA have to gain by traveling to Russia? If you guessed a fistful of dark money, you are correct. In 2013, Butina started a romantic relationship with an NRA member, a Republican activist named Paul Erickson from South Dakota. And after being granted a student visa, she was able to spend more time with him while studying in the United States. While there, she became heavily involved with the NRA and unsurprisingly began sending reports back home to her supervisor, Senator Torshin. And by this time, Torshin had become the head of the central bank. So, to sum things up, Butina infiltrated the NRA and began sending sensitive information back to a scary, powerful Russian with access to tons of money. Butina was even able to organize meetings between Trump and Torshin at NRA conventions. She wanted to make sure that the USA fostered a closer relationship with Russia, one that hopefully wasn't as full of sanctions as it had been under Obama, which is an interesting concern for someone involved in gun rights activism. Unsurprisingly, Butina was being investigated by the FBI, who had begun to suspect that Russia was funneling money into the Trump campaign through the NRA. Now, the NRA does have affiliate political action committees who can and do make regular campaign contributions, but historically there have been caps on donations and limits on how they can be used. These limits are set by the Federal Campaign Elections Act. But in this case, the NRA skirted the rules and failed to disclose their sources. Butina was arrested by the FBI for conspiracy to act as a foreign agent. She spent 4 months in solitary confinement before pleading guilty. In 2018, when the NRA was questioned about their initial trip to Russia, NRA President Pete Brownell was purportedly instructed by his lawyer to pay the NRA $17,000 as a way of getting the trip off the NRA's books. Now, the story of Maria Butina doesn't appear in the Mueller Report, and it's hard to say why. Maybe it's because it has to do with one of the biggest lobbying groups in the country, the NRA, and it could potentially implicate far too many people in high positions of power of election fraud. And when it comes to people in high places in this story, we can't overlook Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump Jr. served as a close political advisor to his father during the 2016 presidential campaign. Whenever someone needed something done, Trump Jr. was the man to get in touch with. On June 3rd of 2016, Trump Jr. received a very unusual email from a music publicist named Rob Goldstone. Being that Trump Jr. isn't in the music industry, you're probably wondering why Goldstone reached out to him at all. As with most every weird email in this insane series of events, you've probably already guessed that it was about digging up dirt on Hillary Clinton. But what possible political connection could a music promoter have to all of this anyway? Well, Rob Goldstone represented Russian pop singer Emma Nagalarov, whose father is a renowned Russian billionaire and real estate mogul who has been described as a close associate of Vladimir Putin. In fact, Galarov's father has even had a meeting with Donald Trump about the possibility of a Trump Tower in Moscow. On June the 9th of 2016, Donald Trump Jr., along with Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, met with a Russian lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya at Trump Tower in New York City. Veselnitskaya had promised him information that would be detrimental to the Clinton campaign. When the New York Times asked Trump Jr. about this, he lied, saying that the meeting was about the Magnitsky Act, a little piece of U.S. legislation that imposed economic sanctions on foreign individuals involved in human rights abuses. To make a long story short, the Magnitsky Act was bad for Russian mobsters. It led to visa bans and asset freezes for those involved in human rights abuses and corruption. The name comes from the case of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a Russian lawyer who died in prison after exposing a large-scale tax fraud scheme. Russia responded to Obama's passing of the Magnitsky Act in 2012 by banning U.S. citizens from adopting Russian children. So what does any of this have to do with Veselnitskaya's promise to give the boys some dirt on Clinton? Well, nothing. So was all of this just a red herring? Maybe. But it should be noted that Veselnitskaya left behind a document for Trump Jr. after the meeting. She later provided a copy of this document to NBC News, and lo and behold, it was a summary of a case she was involved in regarding Sergei Magnitsky. Or at least, that's what she said it was. Whatever was really on the paper she left behind that day, we'll probably never know. So why did Trump Jr. lie about the meeting? In any case, he later posted his email exchange about it on Twitter, just before the New York Times was about to do it for him. So it may just sound like this is a bizarre story that hardly deserves a second look. But this is far from the only connections that Russia has to the Trump kids. In 2014, Eric Trump told golf reporter James Dodson that the Trump organization was able to expand during the financial crisis because, quote, "We don't rely on American banks. We have all the funding we need out of Russia." Mueller's investigation was submitted to Attorney General William Barr on March the 22nd of 2019, compiled into a document that's now known as the Mueller Report. You may remember that Barr's name was featured very prominently in the news in 2019, not just for this case, but also during Trump's investigation of his opponent, Joe Biden, that began just a few months later. Trump apparently contacted Vladimir Zelensky, the newly elected president of Ukraine, the country that's been invaded by Russia. And Trump advised Zelensky to get in touch with William Barr so that the two of them could dig up dirt on Biden, who had, along with his son Hunter, served on the board of a Ukrainian corporation. So William Barr has definitely acted as Trump's advocate and ally since the Mueller investigation. Barr is even said to have booked a $30,000 holiday party at the Trump International Hotel that same year. So what did William Barr have to say about the Mueller report? Well, he said that the special counsel assigned to the Mueller investigation, quote, did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple efforts from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign, end quote. And when you consider that 37 indictments were made, that's quite a lot of assistance with, very real legal consequences. A lot of people were surprised when William Barr decided not to charge Trump with obstruction of justice for firing James Comey. Remember him, the director of the FBI? And as I'm sure you've probably heard, Trump's Department of Justice recently indicted James Comey on charges of lying to a Senate committee in 2020. Comey's been accused of authorizing a leak of classified information to the media, which he denies having done. Trump has also fired James Comey's daughter, Maureen Comey, who was a Justice Department lawyer who had been a federal prosecutor during the trial of Donald Trump's friend, Jeffrey Epstein. And just as an aside, even though the Epstein files were recently released, they're so close to being 100% redacted that the release seems like nothing more than a cruel joke. That number I quoted earlier of Trump's instances of sexual misconduct, that number may be astronomically higher if he is indeed named in the Epstein files. But I digress. Unlike the Epstein files, there's really more than enough available of the Mueller Report for anyone to make an evaluation of its findings, even if it is heavily redacted. That being said, think back to Beetlejuice. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I still haven't let go of that analogy yet. In that story, the Maitlands are plagued by the Dietz family, who have moved into the Maitlands' house and disrupted their world. The Maitlands are warned to keep away from Beetlejuice, a self-proclaimed bioexorcist who bills himself as the solution to their problems. The Maitlands' caseworker advises them to handle their problems on their own, but instead of listening to her advice, the Maitlands are swayed by Beetlejuice, who seems like a quick and easy solution. So the Maitlands unleash his power on the unsuspecting Dietz family. When Beetlejuice soon proves to be a monster that they can't control, the Maitlands quickly discover that they can't put the proverbial genie back into the bottle. Social media has generated a lot of fear in America about those that the Trump administration feels are disrupting the status quo. And Trump has been sold to us as the solution for that fear. Whether or not you believe that he is the undisputed head of a massive cultural movement in America. And while the heavily redacted Mueller report may be dismissed by some as yesterday's news, it's important to keep this missing media alive, so that at the end of the day, you can confidently say whether Donald Trump answers only to the American people or to Russia. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope you join me next time.